Hello everyone, welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. In today's episode, we're returning to our consolidation series, where we slow things down and take a closer look at your questions and the patterns that emerge across them. Recently, I received a number of questions that, while coming from different personal stories, all seem to circle around a similar theme. What happens to anger in the context of growing up in a narcissistic family environment? Many of you describe understanding the guilt, the anxiety, the self-criticism, but there seems to be some confusion, even doubt I can hear about the anger. Does anger and aggression from your early emotional experiences continue to show up in your later life? What we're going to explore today is the transformation of the anger, not simply as something that is expressed or suppressed, but how it can become internally altered. Oftentimes, it's experienced as something dangerous, something to be feared, and in some cases, something that leads to inhibition, self-limiting behavior, and a sense of being stuck in life. An attempt will be made to connect that internal experience of rage to what many of you experience in the present. Difficulty moving forward in work, relationships, and adult development. As something inside of you, that's what it feels like, as if something inside of you is holding you back. So today, thanks to your questions and comments, it's really about following that thread from early relational experiences with anger to how it gets organized internally, and finally, how it shapes the way you live today. So with that in mind, let me turn to a few of the questions I've received from listeners. What I've noticed is that this isn't just one person's experience. It's a little bit of a pattern that shows up across many of your questions and comments. So I want to read a few of them to you together. From a listener, I've been listening to your podcast, and something you've said is sticking with me. That in family where there's a narcissistic parent, the focus is usually on guilt and anxiety. I understand that part in myself, but I don't really understand what happened to my anger. And I've heard you mention anger in several episodes. I either feel like I don't have much anger, or when I do feel it, it turns into something really dark and uncomfortable inside me. I'm in my 30s and I'm still living at home, not really moving forward in my career or relationships. I feel stuck, and I don't know if the anger is part of that, with a question mark. Another way someone wrote this was, I grew up with a father who was controlling, belittling, and emotionally unpredictable. What stands out is that I don't understand my anger. It doesn't feel like it disappeared. It feels like it changed. I don't feel it clearly, but thanks to your podcast, I'm seeing it everywhere now. Sometimes I even notice thoughts that feel extreme or disturbing when I'm angry, but then I shut down. Another listener said something like this. This is in short. I'm wondering if you could say more about anger in this context, because I feel like I'm stuck in my life and I don't understand what's happening. If we listen closely to these accounts, we start to see a very consistent internal process emerging around anger. In your comments, and in my own practice as well, what we find is that uncontained, and I quote that, and I'll go into it in more detail, uncontained anger does not remain experienced as a feeling, but is transformed into a sense of internal danger, often danger to others, which then requires the person to shrink their emotional life. In other words, we can think of this as a process when anger cannot be experienced as, and I quote, an understandable feeling. It is progressively transformed into a sense of internal danger that requires the person to shrink their life. If this isn't clear, let me break it down with a prototypical example. If you grew up in a family with, let's just say, a father who you have come to experience as having marked narcissistic dynamics, you often learn early on that separation, which means doing your own thing or not being there to help or support him in some way, leads to disapproval or a critical response. Going out with friends, for example, isn't experienced simply as independence. It becomes internally organized as something like, and I quote, I'm abandoning, or I'm hurting, and therefore I am bad. Over time, these feelings, this gets internalized as a kind of internal system of monitoring and restriction. An internal voice that tracks autonomy. In other words, if you dare separate or do something of your own, and it quickly turns it into guilt. In this kind of environment, you naturally will experience anger. Let me say that again. You naturally will experience anger, frustration at being controlled, resentment at emotional manipulation, and maybe moments of protest. But that anger creates a very specific internal dilemma for you. On one side, if you feel the anger, if you feel rage, it can quickly become linked to an unconscious fantasy that you might destroy the other person. And I actually hear this quite frequently when I get close to this content in the individuals that I work with. My mother couldn't tolerate my emotions, or my mother is so fragile, easily overwhelmed, unable to tolerate emotional expression. See, that's a fantasy, by the way. Yes, it may have a grain of truth in reality that you have a fragile parent, but this is driven by an unconscious fantasy. If you feel the rage, right, that it's going to be so destructive. On the other side, if you express the rage, again, I frequently hear, I experience myself as bad, wrong, dangerous, or harmful. So the psyche finds a solution to this. Instead of expressing anger, you, and I'm quoting, may, because there are many iterations of this, you may begin to withdraw, to inhibit yourself, to hold things inside. When anger cannot be mentally held, thought about, or given symbolic form, and that just means thinking and talking about it, it does not stay as an affective experience. In other words, the anger instead becomes concretized in the mind as if it were an actual fact about the self. And again, let me break that down. So instead of, I feel rage or I feel angry, it becomes, my rage can kill someone. My rage is dangerous. Maybe I already did something terrible. And these are things that I actually hear. Maybe I already did do something terrible, or in extreme cases, did I kill someone? What becomes important to understand is that this isn't just an internal fantasy. It begins to organize how a person lives their life. If anger is experienced as something dangerous, even if having anger can feel like it makes you, and I quote, a bad or harmful person, then one natural solution is not expression, it's, and I quote, restriction. To return to the listener's question and observations, this is where you begin to narrow your life in very real ways. Why? Again, because the solution is restriction. So what we often see clinically is not someone who's outwardly aggressive. Those are not the individuals I'm addressing today. But someone who's careful with their existence. They don't fully move forward in relationships. They don't fully step into their career. There's often a kind of hovering quality to their development, as if expansion and, I quote, investment in life carries real risk. And this is where the earlier internal logic becomes visible. If I become more myself, if I take up more space, if I move forward, if I am assertive, something inside of me, such as the rage, might get activated, which I cannot control. Or I often hear, what if I can't control it? So instead, you choose safety through limitation. And this isn't conscious. So it's not consciously decided, but it's an emotional necessity that just happens. And this brings us back again to the question several of you wrote in with. You're describing, in very different ways, this same experience of feeling stuck, of not progressing in relationships or in your career, sometimes even living at home well into adulthood and wondering why you can't seem to move forward. What you're beginning to see is that this, and I quote, stuckness is not separate from the internal experience of anger. That's why you're questioning it. And that's the anger that we've been talking about in prior episodes. It is, in many cases, the lived expression of it. So the stuckness is the lived expression of the aggression. Let's return to the prototypical example to illustrate this point a little bit further. When I listen closely to how people describe being stuck, holding themselves back, or feeling unable to move forward in life, oftentimes, not always, I begin to hear the same internal structure repeating itself in different forms. This is where limitation, inhibition, and restriction really comes into focus. In life, there's a constriction of desire, agency, and movement, and instead of direct assertion or risk-taking, what often emerges in its place is a kind of, and I quote, passive complaining. That's an indirect expression of frustration that allows the anger to be discharged without ever fully confronting the underlying rage. I've discovered, on a slightly deeper level, there's often an unconscious logic operating. If I expand, something in me will get out that I cannot control. That's what I was alluding to a bit earlier. Not just anger in the abstract, but anger that feels dangerous, destructive, and potentially harmful to others. So inhibition begins to function as a solution. So that's right, being inhibited, not fully invested, is a solution to this. In other words, self-restriction serves a psychological purpose. It keeps emotional intensity contained. It prevents the imagined possibility of damage from ever emerging. And in many cases, it protects you from ever having to come into contact with the full force of another side of yourself, which is this more angry, frustrated, aggressive side. And the fear that what might happen if that side of yourself was fully felt or expressed. But the cost of this solution is quite significant. Not only do you see diminished vitality, blocked development, and chronic complaining, you also lose the opportunity to actually work through and come to terms with your own anger. So it remains unintegrated, something you hear me talk about quite frequently on this podcast. Remember the split self, right? The split sense of self, the fragmented self, which runs across all the personality disorders, is an unintegrated self. And here it is again. So the anger, since you never come to terms with it, remains unintegrated, continuing to operate from the background rather than becoming something you can understand and use. Now, it's true. If we return again to your questions, some of you are already beginning to sense and recognize that there is anger underneath. One listener even linked it back to his early environment where emotional expression did not feel safe or was met with guilt. Instead of experiencing this as, and I quote, I feel anger that I cannot tolerate, it gets translated into something far more extreme and again, concretized, concrete, literal. Those are the fantasies of danger, harm, or even destruction. In its most dramatic form, it can show up as thoughts like, and I mentioned this earlier, but this is when it gets quite extreme, and I do hear this, maybe I've done something terrible. Or what if I hurt someone? So instead of asking, how do I rid myself of these thoughts? What if we ask, what does this fear represent? And how is it organizing your life? When I encounter these destructive fantasies in practice, the clinical task is not to argue with the content or to reassure the person that they are not dangerous. That misses the point. The task is to help them symbolize the experience of aggression itself, to help it become, and I quote, thinkable as a feeling again. When I hear something like, I might have killed someone, or the more disguised, what I mentioned earlier, passive complaining, we begin to move towards something like this. I am experiencing intense anger, and when I feel it, it becomes frightening to me, as if it could lead to something destructive. Therefore, I must shut it down, Or I must become passive. That's the passive complaining. Restricted and inhibited in life. That's what we begin to uncover. That's the work. That's the integration, because now we're giving words to it. Oftentimes, when anger can be held, and I quote, contained, I mentioned I would come back to that. And you know I'm a big fan of containment if you've been following along. But when it can be held and contained as anger, right? That's it, period. It's anger. Rather than as overwhelming danger, the internal system begins to loosen up a little bit. What was previously organized around fear and restriction can begin to reorganize around experience, thought, thinking, and then eventually, when things go accordingly, movement again, movement in life. As we begin to bring this together, I want to say one more thing about how we actually work with this clinically. To get some movement in life, initially, and I put emphasis on initially, it's important to differentiate feeling from action. The goal is to normalize aggression as part of human relatedness rather than something dangerous. Another goal is to begin to link present-day inhibitions back to earlier relational environments where emotional expression did not feel safe. As always, there's still so much more to say, and I know I have yet again provided you with an incomplete answer. For instance, we didn't have time today to explore a whole nother layer to this, one that is less obvious but equally important. And since I can't resist, I just want to mention it to you briefly, just to give you something to take away and to think about. The restriction that we've been talking about today, the inhibited life, is not only about containing something dangerous inside. It can also function as a way of relating to and even resisting a controlling, powerful figure from earlier in life. Remember I mentioned that prototypical example. Oh no, that was one of the questions that came in. Someone who has a domineering father. If you grew up with a powerful, controlling, or emotionally dominant parental figure, often experienced by you as both grandiose, that's powerful, but punitive as well, then that figure does not simply remain external. It becomes internalized as a kind of fused presence. So a couple of things go in. A highly intelligent parental figure, for example, all-knowing, in control, dominant, and at the same time, critical, punitive, and emotionally constraining you. What is important clinically is that many people are not fully aware of the degree to which they remain identified with this internal figure. Remember I said it gets internalized. That doesn't mean it's conscious. So when we look at passivity, inhibition, or the tendency not to fully invest in life, we're not only seeing fear of internal aggression, again, what we've been exploring in this episode, but I'm adding something in, which is we are also seeing a subtle and often unconscious form of pushback against this internalized parental figure. It is almost as if in the passivity, you're saying, so you pushed me to succeed in life? Now look who's in control here. I'm not going to succeed. In other words, I'm thwarting you. It becomes a way of asserting control, not through direct action, but through refusal, withholding, and non-participation, an unconscious way of reversing the power dynamic with that internal figure. In other words, I'm in control now. You see who's going to suffer? You wanted me to be successful? Look at me now. I'm not moving forward in life. Who's suffering now? Anyway, that's a much deeper and more complicated dynamic than we can really get into today. And it's something we could return to in the future, if you like. If that's something you'd like to hear more about, let me know. As always, please keep the questions coming. Okay, until next time, bye for now. Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.